With so many options, why choose Arizona State University?
For me, the only online option was ASU because of the quality. Their faculty was really involved with their students and care about your personal journey. The dedication to my personal development from my professors, that's been extremely valuable to me.
Earn your degree from the nation's most innovative university. Online. That's a degree better. Explore more than 350 plus undergraduate, graduate, and certificate programs at asuonline.asu.edu.
Well, hello there, and welcome back to the Infinite Inning Reissue series after a week off. I am Stephen Goldman, as always, your host for the Infinite Inning series, and even it would be neat if I had somebody else come in and do these and comment on them. Steve clearly wasn't at his best in this episode. Well, as we'll get to in a moment, I'm clearly not at my best in this reissue for legal reasons. But first, a few words on the subject matter of this reissue episode. For the vast majority of people, moral clarity only comes later, after the events, and then they sign on to the majority view as if they had been subjected to peer pressure, or as if they had thought that all the time. The singer-songwriter Jill Sobule, who died tragically in a fire just a few months ago, had a song, Heroes, which mentions all those French who joined the resistance after the war. Was that stolen valor? Sure, but it points to something more significant. It's easier to just go along, to get along, and not think too hard. It's like one of Claude Rains' best lines in Casablanca. It does seem like almost every line he has in that film is quotable, but I've thought of this one quite a bit over the last 6 months. I blow with the wind, and the prevailing wind happens to be from Vichy. As you know, Vichy was the collaborationist puppet state set up by Germany in the southern part of France after it conquered the country. That way, the Germans didn't have to occupy the whole territory, at least at first, although they did do that after about 2 years. After the big moral testing is over, there follows a period of concordance on the great wrongs of the recent past. Then that generation and the generation it raised starts to die off, and even before that, it loses its cultural potency, and a great unlearning takes place. If you are part of my cohort, you were a child, more or less, of the boomers and a grandchild of the so-called greatest generation. Actually, both my parents kind of fell between those two stools. They were a little old to be boomers, my dad in particular. Sorry, Mom. My mother, like all four Beatles, was born during the war, although she's younger than the youngest of them, the late and much-missed George. Maybe that makes all the difference, actually. After all, the boomers voted for Ronald Reagan and a program of dismantling the New Deal state, which was couched in Cold War and racist rhetoric to overcome the reasons for the existence of the social safety net with something that was more visceral and easy to understand on an emotional level. We're in trouble. We're being stolen from. And it always works. There's a bear in the woods and a welfare queen in the supermarket. That's what sold the country on Reagan. The boomers, you see, forgot what came before them. My folks never did. Again, maybe by virtue of just being a little older. And so, as the late Brian Wilson wrote or co-wrote, I just wasn't made for these times. The Great Depression ended roughly 85 years ago as a result of the greatest government employment program of all time, World War II, brought to you by international aggressive fascism. The war itself, and the threat of fascism, ended 80 years ago this August. Very few people now have a living memory of any of that. I was reading an old magazine from 1940 today, as you know that I do most days, and it mentioned a then-current joke about the threat of a worldwide takeover by one of those dictatorial regimes. This issue came out after France had fallen in June 1940, but more than a year before Pearl Harbor, so the U.S. was not in the war and no one knew if we ever would be. There were just a lot of opinions about whether we should be or inevitably would be. The joke was roughly that, and it was based in truth, the Nazis were trying to work out the purchase of $1 million or so worth of tanks from General Motors. Sure, said GM, which was also kind of a true thing. A lot of American companies cooperated with the Germans, before and sometimes during the war. But what about delivery? Don't worry about that, the Nazis replied. We'll pick them up when we're passing through Detroit. Well, you could joke about the threat because it wasn't yet manifest. Hitler was quoted around that time as saying he had no plans to attack America. But, he reportedly said, America is permanently on the brink of revolution. It will be a simple matter for me to produce unrest and revolts in the U.S. so that these gentry will have their hands full with their own affairs. We have no use for them in Europe. We shall soon have stormtroopers in America. Into the hands of our youth will be given the great statesmanlike mission of Washington, which this corrupt democracy has trodden underfoot. And they did have a nascent version of their stormtroopers. They had the Bund, which had a big youth outreach operation, essentially the American Hitler Youth. And it might have worked too, if not for that same meddling toothbrush mustache guy and his crazy dog, which he later had poisoned, I'm sad to report, as a test of his own suicide capsule. In other words, he didn't give his plans time to come to fruition, and we can all be grateful for that. This week's reissue takes us back to the show's first year and episode 19 from August 31st, 2017. I almost said 1917. It feels like it was that long ago. I was still learning how to do this podcasting thing, and I hope you will forgive my weak delivery and whatever other foibles show up in the episode. There's one big one, which I'll get to in a moment. This episode contained the story of the death of the great, very weird pitcher Rube Waddell shortly after he helped a small town in Kentucky try to avoid being flooded out by the Mississippi River, which is just what the Mississippi River tends to do. As you know, we are still in the aftermath of a national tragedy relating to a river flooding in Texas. The point here was to talk about Waddell, not rivers, but it seems like a good thing to talk about again in order to remind people that rivers are very dangerous beasts. That's why I relate this episode back to the idea that moral clarity or agreement only comes after. We haven't gotten to a place where we agree as a people, or even in individual states, as to how to deal with the facts of nature on the ground. In this week's issue of The New Yorker, there's a good article, a short one by their standards too, for those of you who don't like to read 10,000 words at a shot. It's hard for me too nowadays. The article is by John Seabrook, and it's titled, In an Age of Climate Change, How Do We Cope with Floods? The point is not to scold the counties in Texas that might or might not have mismanaged this crisis or mitigated it somewhat with better preparation, or the federal government. That argument has been made in other places and is alluded to in the article, but rather to make some points about rivers and flood management in general, specifically the futility of building lots of housing and infrastructure in a floodplain and then telling the river, now don't you go there, that would inconvenience us. As an aside, as a parenthetical, in the early 1800s, the Germans straightened the upper Rhine River. They unkinked it. It had a big U in it, and they carved a straight line in it. And that involved a lot of wetland loss, and I've always wondered what kind of species loss the habitat loss caused. That's not something anyone was thinking about too much back then. Now, having read this article, I also wonder what flooding events that led to, and probably leads to, down to the current day. A river's meanders, that's a noun, are part of channeling water. You could say that backwards too, switching your nouns for your verbs. A river's channels cause water to meander instead of flood. After all, you can't have a surge if there's not a large volume that's pent up in a small place. And if you pen in the river, you're going to create that kind of volume with the resultant force from a great body that has almost literally gotten too big for its pants. There's a process of force and counterforce that creates the path that the river takes. We don't seem to accept that. In the Seabrook article, there's a great quote from Kevin Geiger, a former firefighter who's now working in river management and flood mitigation. He says, "The reason the fire department exists is they believe that things are going to burn. But there is no equivalent of a fire department in flood response," Seabrook adds. That's because, Geiger continued, "we don't believe in floods the same way. We don't practice for them." He glanced over at the Ottauquechee River. Maybe it's because fires don't have a benign state like rivers do. Today, The river is happy. The Rube checked out in 1914 when he was just 37 years old. Whatever was up with him, whether his issues were psychological, physical, which is possibly a redundant thing to say, or both, complicated by substance abuse, he was given a set of cards that was unlikely to lead to longevity. If the river hadn't gotten him, something else would have, probably the tuberculosis, which contributed to the weakness that allowed the exposure to the river to kill him. Was 1914 too early to be thinking about the river in the way that we're talking about here? Maybe, but it was also a time of massive hubris on the part of humanity, when we really believed we were masters of the planet and could do whatever we wanted to it without consequences. We, or some of us, still haven't gotten over that idea completely. I don't know if the Rube ever got over that idea where he personally was concerned, but baseball has a way of hurrying things along for its most arrogant players. I mentioned a couple of times a few minutes ago that this reissue episode is kind of a mess. You will hear the sound change quite a bit as we get to the end of the show. As you know, part of my motivation for doing this series of reissues was to remove places where some of the podcasting services had belated trouble with my use of copyrighted music, even as, in the case here, I was commenting on baseball fan Randy Newman's famous Louisiana 1927 in a way that seems to me to be fair use. As always, I am not a lawyer, and I don't have the bandwidth to argue with them anyway. The problem for me in remedying that this week was that I don't have the original tracks after 8 years, if I ever did, actually, and I had made some of my remarks alongside the song as a voiceover. I can't quite separate the two. I used some tools to mask it as much as possible, and then I added a music bed to cover it further, and the result is honestly kind of a mess, a bit of a sonic swamp, but I hope you can overlook that. That's all from me for this reissue episode. You may hear from me again throughout the remainder of the show as I patch over old breaks and the like. As always, thank you for listening to this Infinite Inning reissue episode.
At Arizona State University, we're bringing world-class education from our globally acclaimed faculty to you. Earn your degree from the nation's most innovative university. Online. That's a degree better. Learn more at asuonline.asu.edu.
Sometimes there are only questions. On July 17th, 1956, the Milwaukee Braves were hosting the New York Giants at County Stadium. The Giants' starting pitcher was Ruben Gomez, a star in Puerto Rico who had come to the majors and become something of a star here too, winning 13 games his rookie year and 17 with a 2.88 ERA in his second. He started and won a World Series game that year too. He was a right-handed screwballer, which was kind of cool, and he also had a good fastball and a slider, or curve, depending on what you read. And this is important. He wasn't a guy who shied away from pitching inside or risking fights with high and tight pitches. He didn't hit a lot of guys, at least not in the statistical record, but there were a number of troubling fights that resulted from him hitting or dusting batters. In 1953, he hit Dodgers right fielder Carl Furillo, which ignited a massive brawl that saw Furillo break his hand. He hit Frank Robinson in the head and put him in the hospital. And he even fought his own teammate, Willie Mays, at one point, although they later said that that had been more playful than angry. But whatever the case, this was not a guy who shied away from confrontation or from using his pitches to establish his dominance on the mound, sort of. This day, July 17th, 56, was an exception. The Braves had scored a couple of runs off of Gomez in the bottom of the first, and when the Braves came up to take their turn at bat in the bottom of the second, Gomez was apparently still a little annoyed by that. The leadoff hitter that inning was first baseman Joe Adcock. He's a player who continues to fascinate even though he hung him up way back in 1966. He was one of the great power hitters. His career 336 home runs doesn't sound like a lot now, but at the time he retired it was fairly high up on the list, and the total fails to convey the fact that he got hurt a lot, including for reasons we're about to discuss here, and that periodically various Braves managers would get it in their head that he needed to be platooned or rested for players who weren't nearly his equal in skill, like Joe Torre's older brother Frank. As a result, there are a lot of 300s in the at-bat column on his baseball card that could have been 500s, and if they were 500s, well, he would have put up 30 home runs annually without much of a struggle. When the game in question took place, he was in the midst of what would be the best hitting season of his career. On the season, he hit .291 and slugged about .600 with 38 home runs, and he tended to have huge days. Most famously, in 1954, he had a game at Little Ebbets Field in Brooklyn in which he went 5 for 5 with 7 RBIs and 5 runs scored, including a double and 4 home runs, which set a record for total bases in a game at the time. He had other days like that too. In fact, he had one in 1956, which I'll get to in a second. It's kind of the coda to this story. He had come into the July 17th game crazy hot. In July of 56, he had a Giancarlo Stanton month, the kind of month that Stanton's having now. He hit .358 with 15 home runs in 30 games, and in the 8 games heading into the game in question, he had gone 9 for 27 with 7 home runs. This was a guy who was on fire. He also, by reputation, tended to dig in, crowd the plate. He was a big guy, 6'4", 210, at least according to the official statistics, and so it wasn't unusual for him to get brushed back. Just as Gomez didn't hit a lot at people, Adcock didn't get hit a lot, just 17 times in a 17-year career, and yet, if you read the coverage of him when he was an active player, you'd think the guy was a human pincushion, and I suspect the reason for that is that on the few occasions he actually was hit, it was a very memorable event. So back to the top of the second inning. Gomez threw one inside, and it nailed Adcock on the wrist. There are pictures of him cradling his arm. It wasn't broken or anything, but as he trotted down to first, he was pretty angry. That's where those memorable prior events come into play. Remember that record-setting 18 total base day I mentioned from 1954? Well, in the next game, the Dodgers hit Adcock in the head. Later that year, Don Newcombe of the Dodgers hit Adcock in the hand, breaking his thumb and ending his season. The following July, in 1955, Giants pitcher Ed Hearn hit him on the wrist and broke it, ending his season after 84 games. Further, the Giants, who had been managed by Leo DeRocher for the previous 7 years, were known as a head-hunting ball club, although what's interesting about that is that they didn't put up crazy high hit-by-pitch totals at that time. Sal Magley, the famous barber, never led the National League in hit batters. And on reflection, I wonder if that doesn't prove anything. The real headhunters, as opposed to the psychopaths and guys who are actually wild and can't control what they're doing, are so good with their command that they rarely do actually hit anybody. They just shave them a bit, like a barber, who comes close with his blades but doesn't cut. So Adcock likely has some or all of this history on his mind as he's trotting down to first base, and he says some rude things to Gomez. Gomez said some rude things back. Whatever they were sufficiently provocative to spur Adcock into action. He turns at first base and goes running for the mound, head down. As I said, 6'4", 210 at least, this is an imposing specimen to be charging at you on the mound. Gomez, by the way, 4 inches shorter, 40 pounds lighter. Still, Gomez was typically all for this kind of thing, so what he did next doesn't seem like it's in character. Seeing Adcock, he took the baseball and threw it at him and hit him a second time. This time on the thigh. That wouldn't be sufficient to stop a charging rhinoceros, which was pretty much what Adcock was at that point. So Gomez, realizing he was right out of bullets, turns and runs like hell, making for the Giants' dugout. Now the entire Braves team is charging in from the outfield, from the infield, in pursuit of Gomez, trying to cut him off from reaching the safety of the clubhouse. Simultaneously, all the Giants on the field, all the umpires, and the occasional policemen are also charging for the Giants' dugout, trying to intercept the Braves. Gomez made it, hadn't covered himself in glory, and the umpires and the cops managed to sort things out before a huge riot erupted. Gomez had to be escorted by policemen from the clubhouse back to the team hotel to ensure his safety. But one thing that's in all subsequent tellings of this story, and I'm not sure if it's true or not, it's not in any of the newspaper reports, is that Gomez ran all the way to the clubhouse and then came back to the dugout to continue the fight, this time holding an ice pick in his hand. That wasn't noted by the National League when they handed down their punishments for this event. Gomez got a 3-game suspension and a $250 fine. Adcock was just fined $100, wasn't suspended at all. His only comment was, "I've never been so mad in all my life." Once Adcock had cooled down, when reporters asked if he expected Gomez to apologize to him, he said, "I don't know. Maybe I should apologize to him." Gomez said, "I saw him coming at me, so I threw the ball at him. I ran away because I didn't want him to break my ribs." So as I said, I have questions. First of all, what did Adcock and Gomez say to each other that got them both so worked up? Second, Why did Gomez run away when he typically relished a fight? Third, what made him assume that Adcock was going to go for his ribs? When baseball fights break out, you don't typically see players thinking, "Work the body," as if Burgess Meredith's character from Rocky was coaching them from just outside the ring. They just swing away in not particularly any strategic fashion. Finally, what the hell was an ice pick doing in the visitors' clubhouse at Milwaukee County Stadium? And would Gomez have really punctured a player on a major league ball field? I suppose we'll never know. Mahatma Gandhi once said, "It is better to be violent if there is violence in our hearts than to put on the cloak of nonviolence to cover impotence." Gomez managed to do all of the above? One last note, if you like small, wholesome style payback. The day after the game, Adcock went 2 for 4 with 2 RBIs and a run scored against the Giants. And then, in the final game of the series, he had one of those Joe Adcock days. 4 for 4, a double, 2 home runs, 8 RBIs. Naturally, Braves manager Fred Haney gave his last at-bat of the day to Frank Torrey. I'm Stephen Goldman, and this is the Infinite Inning Baseball Podcast. Well, hello there. What's the name of this bed and breakfast, you say to Evinrude? The Alamo, Evinrude replies, not even looking up from his guidebook. Well, wait, you say, if it's a bed and breakfast, why are all those fellas with guns walking around on the roof? You ask so many questions, says Evinrude. How about that army camped across the way there? Local color, says Evinrude. Accepting his explanation, you enter the building. You are greeted by an odd maitre d' who identifies himself as Colonel Travis and requests that you take the first watch. Welcome, Congressman Crockett, he says. Who's Congressman Crockett, you say? My name is Gorovitz. Funny joke, Congressman Crockett, Colonel Travis says. Here's your gun. And so you find yourself not at the Holiday Inn, but atop a crumbling mission as all the soldiers in the world run screaming towards you, waving pictures of your mother. You scream, shocking yourself awake, and you realize you shouldn't have watched all those Disney Channel Fess Parker reruns before bed. Time to take that pill that Dr. Ephraim prescribed for you, the one that prevents you from having psychotic delusions about heroic congressmen. With a feeling of deep relief, you reach for a bottle labeled Episode 19. Damn, you think, but I looked good in that coonskin cap. Welcome back to the show. Before we move on, just in the interest of honesty, and to give you a glimpse of what my daily life is like, I just want to share with you that last bit as it actually occurred. You see, my big 20-pound black and white cat Mickey was helping me do some recording tonight. Let's go back to the end of the little reverie you just heard. With deep relief, you reach for a bottle labeled Episode 19. Damn, you think, but I looked good in that coonskin cap. Ladies and gentlemen, the joy of being a cat owner. We have, I almost said the cliche, we have a really great show for you tonight. But no, let's not go all show business. It's just me, and the whole enterprise is spectacularly humble. I want to talk to you about a pitcher, a great pitcher, who was born almost 141 years ago and died 103 years ago at the age of 37, named Rube Waddell. Waddell was a very strange character. There was something off about him compared to how we classify normality of emotion or thought. There was something wrong, but there was also something very, very right. Keep that in mind as we continue. Like most Americans, it's been hard for me to tear my thoughts away from the disaster down in Texas, the flooding brought on by Hurricane Harvey, which has reached almost biblical proportions. They've obliterated every American record for rainfall, not just in the state of Texas, not just in the month of August, but just rainfall, period. Even if you're a faraway observer, or are so narrow mentally that you're only concerned as a baseball fan. This is the most trivial of things, but the hurricane even affects that with the arguments over the relocation of various Astros games. But what's really striking beyond the extent of the disaster and the suffering that has occurred because of it is how familiar it all is. I've lived through some of the more intense versions of these storms that, from time to time, but perhaps with increasing frequency, make their way up north, even if they're not a patch on the kind that come directly from the Gulf of Mexico onto the continental United States. And I also married into a family of Mississippians, so I've gotten to meet and talk with many people who have experienced some of these historic storms and the humanitarian disasters that resulted from them. It's striking how unprepared we always are, how next time we swear we will be prepared, but when next time comes, it's just like the first time, every time. And there's no indication that this time Hurricane Harvey will change anything. I was just reading the Washington Post. This was published on August 29th, and I quote, "Congress is likely to approve a Harvey recovery bill, as it has after past disasters, to cover the huge cost of storm damages. The cuts proposed by the administration would slice away funding for long-term preparedness efforts, many of them put in place to address the sluggish federal response to Hurricane Katrina in 2005. The proposed cuts would include programs run by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, which helps rebuild homes, parks, hospitals, and community centers, the National Weather Service, which forecasts extreme storms, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, whose research and community engagement helps coastal residents prepare for disaster." So, like I said, nothing will change until the next time. And if you're familiar with what happened with Katrina when doctors were euthanizing elderly patients they couldn't move out of the flooded hospitals, you know just how bad it can get. So in defiance of nature, we'll take away some money and make it harder for people to recover this time or to deflect the next time. Rube Waddell, there was something very, very wrong with him, and yet he knew you don't do that. You don't make it harder on people, or harder on yourself for that matter, in an emergency. You roll up your sleeves and you pitch in. Rube lived to help people. No one exactly knew what his motives were or why he enjoyed it so much, but he did. And he lived and he died for that, in circumstances very much like those now. I could fill a couple of hours with a full biography of him, but suffice it to say that as a pitcher, he was peak Randy Johnson or Sandy Koufax, and he put up their kinds of strikeout totals, 300 strikeouts and more, at a time when batters were too busy bunting to strike out very much at all. As I've suggested, as a man, he was damaged somehow. You can almost see it in his formal portraits. His eyes pierce you in a way that's a little uncomfortable. What was wrong with him defied diagnosis at the time, and if we had him here, maybe we could figure it out with modern techniques, but failing that, it's impossible to know. Alcoholism definitely had something to do with it, but drunk or sober, he seemed to have no impulse control, getting himself into fights with teammates or fans in the stands, hopping the train for the coast in the middle of a series in Milwaukee, eventually turning up as a referee of a boxing match or as one of the boxers themselves, or tending bar in a saloon, or playing fullback on the local football team or goalie for the local soccer team. Who even knew Americans played soccer in 1900? And on one occasion when they couldn't find him, he was located under the stands shooting marbles with kids. And he reportedly greatly resented being dragged away from that to go pitch a major league ball game. A lot of times he just took off to go fishing, particularly when a club had fined him for being drunk and disorderly. He loved fishing. That's another thing that's hard to figure because it's such a quiet, contemplative activity for somebody who was always running off somewhere. But this is my favorite story of missing Rube Waddell. I think this was with the Philadelphia A's, but who knows? It could have been with any of his many teams, and it also could have been mythical. He's supposed to make his start, but he can't be found anywhere, and Connie Mack has his coaches and ball players fanned out around Philadelphia looking everywhere for Rube. Is he in a saloon drinking? Where could he be? Where could he be? Mack and his boys are at a total loss, but then they hear this.
Friends, nothing could be more public domain than the works of John Philip Sousa, but perhaps the recording that I used was not. Therefore, I'm afraid that I'm just going to have to describe the gag to you, which is that Connie Mack's men heard parade music, saw the parade coming down the street, and were very surprised to see their ace pitcher, perhaps in full Harold Hill uniform, leading the parade. 76 Waddells.
You have to hand it to him. That's a hell of a stunt. And I don't even know if it was a stunt. He was kind of a cross between Ferris Bueller and Chancey Gardner. He was just the kind of guy who would wake up one morning and a couple hours later would be leading a parade. He was much more likely, though, to be pulling people out of a burning building. He had a thing about fires, or specifically firemen. I make him sound like an arsonist, but he was the opposite. He lived to put out fires.
He worshipped firemen to the extent that he sometimes wore a red union suit under his baseball uniform so he could rip it off like Superman if he heard a siren. And whereas fans or opposing teammates could throw him off his game by distracting him with a cute puppy or a scary snake, nothing got him like fire engines. Connie Mack said this in Baseball Magazine in 1912. "We used to put Rube in center field when we weren't pitching him. He never wanted to sit on the bench, and we had to humor him or he wouldn't have stayed on the lot. He was a bully fielder, too. One day we were having quite a battle with some team, and Rube was covering center field for us. We were being hard-pressed. With only one out, the other team filled the bases in the fifth inning, and a brace of good batters were up. We had 2 strikes on the next man, and then something happened. A black cloud of smoke appeared in the sky back of center field fence, and a little later a blaze. Then came the clash and clanking of fire bells and the clatter of horses' hoofs. I happened to look in the direction of the blaze. High up on the center field fence, I saw Rube perched, looking at the blaze silhouetted against the red glare of the conflagration. I let out a blast that nearly woke the dead. Rube heard me and looked around. He seemed undecided as to his next move, but he wasn't long in making up his mind. With a graceful salute of his hand as if to say, 'So long, fellows!' he dropped from sight on the other side of the fence and was on his way to the fire. And he didn't just spectate when he got to the fire. He ran into burning buildings and dragged people out. This is documented. And that's not the only thing. I mean, once he was on the ferry from Camden to Philadelphia when someone played a joke on Rube by shouting, 'Woman overboard,' he dove in. That's how he was about those things. And it happened on the baseball field, too. Now look, some of this might be a little exaggerated. And just as Retro Sheet hasn't yet found a game that Rube Waddell played in center field as proposed in the previous anecdote, newspaper reports at the time don't describe this exactly the way I'm going to tell it to you. But as the song goes, some of this is true and some of this is better, and this is how I prefer to think about it. On July 1st, 1904, the A's were in Boston playing the Red Sox. The Red Sox starter was a pitcher named Jesse Tannehill. And at bat was an outfielder, a young one, a second-year player named Danny Hoffman, and Rube had taken a liking to him. Well, Tannehill came inside, and Hoffman couldn't get out of the way. He didn't even try, really. People describe what happened to Ray Chapman the same way, as if he was in a trance-like state, hypnotized by the ball and just couldn't move. And the ball smacked him right under the right eye. It was apparently a devastating injury. He went down. Some reports say that the eye was nearly pushed out of the socket by the force of the blow. The A's surrounded the kid. The team doctor came out. And everybody's saying, "Where's the ambulance already? Where's the ambulance?" It was being really slow to get there, and the doctor, nervous, said, "The ambulance doesn't get here now, he's going to die right here." And Rube, hearing this, picked up Hoffman, threw him over his shoulder, and ran him out of the ballpark and onto the street where he got in a cab. And by cab, I possibly mean the kind that was drawn by horses. This was 1904. He then sat with the kid in the hospital all night in his baseball uniform, sponging his brow until he regained consciousness. Rube spent 6 years with the A's. Connie Mack was able to deal with him for much longer than any other baseball official in his life. But in 1905, on the eve of the World Series, he tore up his pitching arm, scuffling with a teammate over a hat. Some people thought maybe he had been bribed to skip the series, but that doesn't appear to be the case. And although he could still pitch after that, he wasn't peak Chris Sale good anymore. He was just pretty good. And that wasn't enough for Connie to deal with him anymore, so he traded him off. Sold him, actually. He pitched for the Browns for a few years before drifting into the minors, and he wound up with the Minneapolis Millers of the American Association. And the manager there, Joe Cantillon, decided to look out for him. In the winter of 1912, he took Rube home with him to his farm, which was in Hickman, Kentucky. Hickman, then as now, is in the southwest corner of the state. It's right on the Mississippi River. And the Mississippi, as it did in 1927, overran its banks and threatened to inundate the town. Who do you suppose it was who stood in the ice-cold torrent, water up to his nipples, piling sandbags? Yes, Rube Waddell. It was water, not a fire, but he looked at it the same way. Pneumonia set in, and he barely survived it and couldn't really shake it. And at that point, perhaps taking advantage of his weakened body, tuberculosis came on board as well. He struggled to pitch for one more year, but he couldn't do it. He was wasted, and a guy who had been 6'1" and 200 pounds was literally shrinking before everyone's eyes. He was failing. In the winter of 1913, he was found incoherent and feverish wandering the streets of St. Louis. Cantillon took charge of him, sent him to Texas where his sister was living. Waddell had been married many times, but more often than not wound up in jail for non-support and subsequently divorced. As he further declined, he ended up in a sanitarium and died April 1st, 1914. Connie Mack had helped pay for his medical care, as he would later, along with John McGraw, help pay for him to receive a proper headstone. And if his death wasn't a direct result of going down in the flood, then the man fulfilling his desire to be a hero was at the very least a proximate cause. I'm sure you remember the 1974 Randy Newman song, Louisiana 1927. What always strikes me about the song is not just the swelling chorus or the introduction that is right out of Stephen Foster or Gone with the Wind, but the third verse, when the President of the United States appears. In real life, the President didn't even come down. Calvin Coolidge said no, he would not go see the flood. The writers and governors and congressmen begged him to heed their call and offer some succor to the people whose lives had been washed away. Instead, he sent Herbert Hoover. And Herbert Hoover did a pretty good job, all things considered, but he also did it on a shoestring because neither he nor Coolidge believed that the government should help anybody whose lives had been swept away by a natural disaster. Hoover relied on the Red Cross, just like we do now. And look, the help isn't enough because in some ways it never can be enough. Still, why is it that we haven't learned anything and we don't know now what Rube Waddell knew over 100 years ago? See, even if the president wasn't really there, that much is accurate. The politician says, "Isn't it a shame?" and shakes his head and goes, "But that's all you get." To get more, you need a hero. You need somebody who has something very, very wrong with them, who's distracted by puppy dogs and fire engines, but also knows right from wrong and knows what Franklin Roosevelt said long after his death is true, that when your neighbor's house is on fire, you don't haggle over the price of a garden hose. And if he happens to be a left-handed pitcher with lightning in his arm, so much the better. By Atticus's spectacles, we've reached the end of another show.
This is where I used to tell you how to locate me and the guest on social media. However, the guest is not part of this reissue, and neither is that particular venue for social media. However, you can find me at Stephen Goldman
and you can watch the
social, where I post a lot of the kinds of things that you hear me talking about on the Infinite Inning, including the random fruits of my research, mostly old ads for laxatives and things like
because
that.
when I went
if
by
it's
grab
baseball
Stephen
players
Goldman,
who are
the cruises I
constipated
got
on
whenever I
staying on
walked down the
theme,
street
right?
were terrible. You can also write in at infiniteinning@gmail.com. And please, as always, rate us at the podcasting service of your choice, iTunes or what have you. It really is appreciated. As James Cagney said in Yankee Doodle Dandy, my mother thanks you, my father thanks you, my sister thanks you, and I thank you. We have a sponsor now, but nonetheless, this episode is still brought to you by the number 34. Our producer has been mixing this show on a 1935 Spartan 558 sled radio, which explained so much, but I can't argue with him, it's so pretty. Our theme song, The Infinite Man, was co-written by myself and Dr. Rick Mooring. When I was Rick's best man, I gave a rather long toast, and when I sat down, another good friend said, "You know, it wasn't a very good toast, but it's not your fault. We just overestimated you as a writer and set the bar too high." Later, his drunk uncle told me that it was just something he had to sit through, like a funeral or my daughter's tuba recital. I always have thought of myself as a member of the family. Well, if things are only half as bad as 5 times the amount of foreboding I have about 2/3 of the state of things, then I'm 99% likely to be back next week.
And that's all for this reissue episode of The Infinite Inning. Thank you for listening. And here's to the cat I mentioned earlier. Poor old Mickey, he got a raw deal and checked out early. I miss my 20-pound cat. And I'll miss you until this weekend when episode 340 of The Infinite Inning brings us together again.